Shadow the Hedgehog is a bad game. Everyone on the internet thinks so, and as we know, the internet has never been wrong. But why is Shadow the Hedgehog a bad game? After all, on the GameCube it was given the Player's Choice banner on the box, and despite poor reviews, it sold 1.59 million units across multiple platforms, according to Sega, which is more than Sonic Heroes as of 2004. But I'm sure that despite it being a beloved entry in the Sonic franchise, there's some reason that deep down, Shadow the Hedgehog is a bad game. The internet wouldn't lie to me. So let's dive in. But first, a history lesson. For the three of you unaware, Shadow the Hedgehog is a spin-off of the Sonic franchise. I won't get into the series' history too much, but I would like to mention the games that Shadow is based on in terms of format. In 1998, Sega released Sonic Adventure for its floundering Dreamcast system. The series' sort of first foray into 3D platforming. It was considered a mainline game and sold gangbusters, 2.5 million units on the Dreamcast alone. Later reissues of the game, like Sonic Adventure DX Director's Cut on other platforms, also sold well. Not only this, but they reviewed well too, but in recent years this critical acclaim has fallen under scrutiny. People have realized that Sonic Adventure wasn't very good mechanically for many reasons. Glitches, poorly thought out game mechanics, a shoestring plot. By today's standards, it's pretty much a mess. Many people consider it very highly for nostalgic reasons, of course, but many late entrants into Sonic, myself included, consider it a mess, especially compared to relatively polished entries in the 2D realm, like Sonic Rush and Sonic Advance. This reputation also extends to Sonic Adventure 2, which, while streamlining much of the irritation, still has issues with performance, not to mention some truly unfortunate PC ports. At the same time, the games were groundbreaking, but in the modern era they show their age. These were games made around the same time as Super Mario Sunshine and Wind Waker, games that, in spite of similarly rushed production, managed to be timeless. Games produced externally would expand on this formula, like Sonic Heroes, which would improve greatly, but ultimately not be enough to captivate new players or fans. There were also the limp attempt at a series reboot in the adventure style that we now know today as Sonic 06. When I say adventure style, I mean this type of game. Unlike the early games with cartoonish graphics, adventure-style games feature more realistic environments, more involved stories, and of course 3D gameplay with features like the homing attack and auto-run sections. Broadly speaking, there's just something about 3D Sonic that didn't work. Nothing meshed together, the gameplay failed to be satisfying, and in the end it failed the test of time. But what specifically about the adventure-style games made them bad? Not just the broad strokes, the specifics. Well, from game to game, different things, but there were certain unfortunate design choices that were on all three adventure-style games. 1. Enemies. Enemies in adventure-style games are largely pointless. The exception to this is bosses, which we'll talk about in a moment. But there's a common problem that proliferated during the 3D Switch in this era, not just with Sonic, but with other franchises too, like Mario. In 2 dimensions, there are only 2 options to face an enemy, both of which are usually valid strategies. 1. Defeat the enemy. This can be done with a head bonk in Sonic's case, or in later 2D games a spin dash. You can also avoid them. These 2 strategies are balanced, each affords certain rewards, but every enemy has to be reckoned with in some fashion. In 3D, this issue is gone. Since there is an additional dimension to move in, as well as movement broadly being expanded, enemies in this game are a joke. Sonic 06 tried to circumvent this by giving most enemies some sort of projectile, but these stationary foes can still be sped past with ease. The exception is bosses, which make up most of Sonic Adventure's rogues gallery, but they have some issues of their own. The biggest one plagues all 3 of these games, and that is the nightmare of waiting. We've all seen this problem before. A foe comes forth, impervious to all damage, except for when the player knocks one of its projectiles back at it, or strikes at a big glowing eye. This is not only monotonous, but it also kind of undermines the threat of a boss. The boss having some glaring weakness in any game depletes its threat level, and when the boss dishes out missiles that can be redirected at it repeatedly, it just seems foolish. So enemies and bosses in Sonic, a huge part of the design of both 2D and 3D, fall totally flat. 2. Level design. Many games that ventured into 3 dimensions faced a similar problem. Different movements meant levels had to be wildly changed. There are 2 approaches to this, the Mario approach and the Crash Bandicoot approach. Crash Bandicoot preserved linear levels by limiting some of Crash's movement in certain directions. For instance, in the first level, much of it pushes Crash forward, while different sections later look more like a traditional side-scroller. Mario did away with linearity altogether, making each level a little scavenger hunt, allowing each level to be multi-purpose as well. Neither approach is better or worse, but each one is decent at addressing the increased freedom that 3D movement affords. Sonic, on the other hand, does neither. In Adventure, the levels are mostly linear, but they lack the clear direction of Crash, and the adventure fields are open-ended, but they lack any discerning characteristics. So it's either aimless linearity or empty openness, the antithesis of both approaches in the same game. The best way to sum this up is a potent sense of, where do I go? These sprawling, featureless adventure fields are totally bereft of directions, and the linear levels are impossible to traverse without getting lost or taking leaps of faith. 3. Movement. Much like how levels cannot be the same in 3D, movement must also be different. Sonic's defining characteristic is speed, so naturally he runs very quickly. This, in most levels, is basically a nuisance, as Sonic can easily be sent careening into an abyss with a feather touch to the controller, but it's still fun during certain segments. A pity, then, that all of these segments take control away from the player momentarily. In 2D Sonic games, a level can be completed smoothly, given that one knows where the enemies are. Players are punished by a cessation of speed when you run into an enemy. Sometimes the enemies appear faster than you can react, but still, the punishment for messing up is a loss of momentum. In Sonic Adventure games, however, speed can be brought to a halt by any number of things. Platforming challenges, enemies, a specific move needing to be used, running into a wall. Not only this, but movement in 3D games is paradoxically simplified. Sure, Sonic has more moves, like a homing attack, but the use for each move is now much more specific. In a 2D game, jumps, spin dashes, and rolls could be used to tackle enemies, break through blocks, and build speed quickly, multi-purpose and open-ended. In 3D, Sonic's moves have specific uses, and sometimes enemies are set up such that their entire purpose is to be homed into to bridge a gap. Another example is the ring dash move, seldom used except for when required by the story. All this isn't to say that Sonic Adventure is bad, of course. A lot of people still like those games to this day. All I'm saying is that they have similar problems that became more and more obvious until culminating in 2006. These flaws then paint the picture of why Shadow the Hedgehog is bad too. They're problems that were exacerbated in Sonic's edgy brother getting the game of his own. Or were they? Another reason people loved Sonic the Hedgehog and the adventure-style games wasn't due to the gameplay, however. It was Sonic's famous attitude! I won't give you the history lesson, but Sonic was crafted to be the yang to Mario's yin. Nintendo presented itself as a kid-friendly and cartoonish company, so Sonic and Sega decided to answer this by being kid-friendly and cartoonish as well, but also sometimes sassy. And instead of being a platformer with enemies that you jump on the heads of with gameplay based around momentum, early Sonic platformers were ones where you jumped on the heads of enemies with gameplay based around momentum, but faster. In a way, it reminds me of the merry melodies from Disney versus the silly symphonies from Warner Brothers. After all, the productions were pretty similar, but the main difference was the attitude. To me, it's the difference between this and this. In the adventure games then, when the series lead Takashi Tezuka saw the direction of modern gaming 1990s, he realized that Sonic's attitude would quickly become passé. Quite rightly then, he decided to make a more edgy interpretation of Sonic in the form of Shadow, with a new attitude to match changing times. But instead of a sassy prankster, Shadow the Hedgehog would be brooding, an edgy anti-hero, which, while a good idea on paper, well...
Not even good enough to be
I'll
my
make you eat those words!
Nonetheless, people seem to like Shadow fine. He was a fan favorite, in fact, which, after Adventure 2's release and Sega's dissolution into a third-party dev, Sonic Team decided to make a game based on Shadow. The first thing people notice about Shadow the Hedgehog is the stark contrast in style from previous entries in the Sonic series. You can see the trajectory by the box art of the various games. Sonic the Hedgehog's box art features a slightly sassy hedgehog in front of a big bright blue sky. Adventure 1 features another blue sky, but with Sonic you might see at a teen skate park. Adventure 2 features Shadow on it, a little darker and more gritty, but still within the bright, colorful style of Sonic. Then there's Shadow's box art. It's way different. Sonic was certainly headed down some kind of edgy trajectory, but this is something different altogether. Look at this. It's lame. I mean, it's kind of cool with Shadow holding some kind of nondescript bazooka with an explosion behind him, getting you all pumped up to join the action. Man, Shadow extending his hand as though he's in need of your help. I mean, no, it sucks. It sucks, right? Between this and Adventure 2, also, is Sonic Heroes, which was developed by a third party and featured a return to Adventure 1's more bright blue sky design. When people saw this, they said, "That's not Sonic," and well, no, it's not. But was Shadow the Hedgehog trying to be Sonic? Sure, it was the same franchise, but the game was trying to tackle a different theme. Is that really so terrible? I mean, sure, if you wanted something specific out of Sonic, Shadow would be a letdown, but what if you weren't? What if you were open to a new experience? What if you shed the context of the Sonic series? To series veterans, that might sound tough, but when I was growing up, Shadow was my first ever Sonic game. I didn't know anything about the lore, I didn't know anything about the series. All I knew was Shadow looked badass. And I'm gonna be honest, he still kinda does. In fact, I can't hide it any longer. I bait and switched you. I actually think Shadow the Hedgehog isn't just a good game. I think it's the best adventure-style game that they've ever made. There's a lot of debate online as to whether Shadow is a spin-off or whether it's a mainline entry. To me, this argument is kind of limp. Like I said before, this was my first Sonic game, and if I'm honest, one of my only ones. I'll explain why in a moment, but this experience has led me to believe that Shadow the Hedgehog is best enjoyed in a vacuum. It seems to have been designed as an entry point, with the story revolving around Shadow's origins. Shadow has no memories of his past, and it's up to the player to forge that path through their and his choices in the games. It's built so no outside context is necessary, and in fact, outside context hurts the story. Most criticism online revolves around this. It's actually fascinating how this game is critiqued. Most poor reviews cite story first and foremost, and when they do review gameplay, they complain about the very same things that have always existed in adventure-style games. More than anything else, I think this game reviewed so poorly not because it's bad, but because it's so different, in a way that was disappointing to longtime Sonic fans in a very stark way. People dislike the game for superficial reasons, and their opinion is reinforced by others online. That's not to say their dislike is invalid, of course not, but I'm saying that it led to Shadow not getting a fair shake. A fair shake that I would like to give it today.
Discovering the secret of my past will be nearly impossible. I'll take those odds. Meet Shadow the Hedgehog. His mysterious past holds the key to the world's future. Is he a hero or a villain? You decide. Either way, you'll have a blast. Rated E10 for ages 10 and up.
I remember Shadow's ad campaign very distinctly. It revolved around the idea of hero or villain. This would become standard a few years later with games like Mass Effect and Infamous, so a lot of people call this a morality system, but to me that's an oversimplification. Unlike other games with morality like Undertale or Infamous, Shadow is meant to be played repeatedly, each campaign being only a few hours long. This is less a morality system and more like a branching paths system. I wouldn't call it a morality system because this isn't an RPG. Shadow is a character who is external to you, and ultimately the player can only lead him to certain outcomes. Semantics aside, this hero or villain aspect sums the entire game up pretty elegantly, but not in the sense that you can decide to be hero or villain, and more like find out if Shadow is hero or villain, and having that choice be left to the player. Since Adventure 1, there have been different stories that are available to be played, but Shadow's branching story is different. I see these branching paths being compared in other reviews and analysis, but frankly, they're completely dissimilar. For instance, in Adventure 1, after completing Sonic's story, you can view the story from another character's perspective. It's the same story from a different perspective. Same with Adventure 2's story and Heroes' three-way split. Not to mention, with some of these stories, you're uncovering the whole story, whereas each Shadow playthrough is short and only depicts some of the story. A lot of reviews talk about how Shadow's story is incoherent, and that's because each story playthrough there are things that the player won't necessarily understand yet. This game isn't meant to be played through once, it's meant to be played many times over to get all the endings. These reviewers are criticizing something intentional about Shadow's story. You're meant to uncover it by playing through each thread. Like I said, all of these reviews are based on Shadow as if it were any other Sonic Adventure game, when really, the comparison is apples and oranges. But what about the game itself? Sure, the reviews might have been biased, but that doesn't mean the game is good. It just means that they were too harsh on it. It still might suck after that. Next time, we'll see how Shadow the Hedgehog was as a game. I split these videos into two so I could get them out on time, so this one is the first part, and the next one will be the second part, but they can be viewed on their own. I'd like to thank my patrons for this month: Sebastian Hagert, Zach Vincent, Kaleidoscope, Elizabeth, Luna, and as usual, Jojiro. Shout out to Jojiro for being my first subscriber and still hanging around, so that's just nice. Also, I had to start my Twitter from scratch, so if anyone is not following me at BigFunkyJ, my